In just 5 years, one disease killed half of Europe, 200 million people dead, entire villages abandoned, bodies piling up faster than they could be buried.
The market
Black
thrives
Death
today.
of the
Indeed,
1300s
the prices are
was
fair.
the
Let us
deadliest
purchase what we
pandemic
need.
in human history, and it changed civilization forever. This is the complete story of how a single bacterium brought medieval Europe to its knees. The story begins in Central
Look here,
Asia
this shard could
around
be significant.
1338.
Indeed, the markings match the
bacterium
ancient text.
Yersinia
Keep digging, there
pestis
may be more.
had been circulating in rodent populations for centuries, but something changed. The Mongol Empire had created
path
the
ahead is
largest
clear.
trade network
Good.
in history.
We should reach the
The
village by
Silk
dusk.
Road connected
Indeed.
China to Europe through Central Asia. This meant unprecedented movement of goods, people, and unfortunately, disease. Historians believe the plague originated in the steppes of Central Asia, possibly near Lake Issyk-Kul in modern-day Kyrgyzstan. Archaeological evidence
In the shadow
shows
of
mass
plague, the
graves
doctor and
from
his companions press
1338
on,
to
mapping the spread of
1339
death across
with
the land.
inscriptions mentioning pestilence. The disease traveled along trade routes, moving through merchant caravans. Infected fleas lived on rats, and rats traveled on ships and wagons. Every trade route became a highway for death. By 1346, the plague had reached the Black Sea. The pivotal moment came at the siege of Kaffa, a Genoese trading port in Crimea. Mongol forces besieging the city began dying from plague. In a horrifying early example of biological warfare, they catapulted infected corpses over the city walls. The Genoese merchants fled by ship, carrying the plague with them. In October 1347, 12 ships arrived in Sicily. Most sailors were dead. Those still alive were desperately ill, covered in mysterious black boils. Italian authorities tried to turn them away, but it was too late. The Black Death had arrived in Europe, and nothing would ever be the same. The plague came in 3 forms, all caused by the same bacterium. Bubonic plague was the most common, transmitted by flea bites. Within 2 to 6 days of infection, victims developed buboes, painful, swollen lymph nodes in the groin, armpit, or neck, growing to the size of eggs or apples. These turned black from internal bleeding, giving the disease its name. Victims suffered high fever, chills, vomiting, muscle pain, and delirium. The mortality rate was 50 to 60%, even with the body's immune response. Without treatment, most died within a week. Pneumonic plague was deadlier, affecting the lungs. This form spread person to person through coughing, like COVID-19, but far more lethal. Once lungs were infected, victims coughed blood and died within 2 to 3 days. Mortality rate, nearly 100%. Septicemic plague occurred when bacteria entered the bloodstream directly. Victims' fingers, toes, and nose turned black from gangrene. Death came within hours, sometimes the same day as symptoms appeared. Medieval people had no understanding of bacteria or disease transmission. They believed in miasma theory, that bad air or foul smells caused illness. They blamed planetary alignments, God's wrath, earthquakes releasing poisonous vapors, or Jewish communities poisoning wells. The truth was microscopic. Yersinia pestis lived in fleas that fed on black rats. When an infected rat died, fleas jumped to new hosts, including humans. A single flea bite could kill you. The disease spread with terrifying speed. Cities were death traps. Crowded conditions, poor sanitation, and abundant rats created perfect conditions. The plague moved at 2 to 3 kilometers per day in rural areas, but in cities it could infect entire neighborhoods overnight. Between 1347 and 1353, the Black Death killed an estimated 75 to 200 million people worldwide. In Europe alone, 30 to 60% of the population died. Italy was hit first and hardest. Florence lost 60,000 of its 120,000 residents. The famous writer Giovanni Boccaccio witnessed bodies stacked like cordwood in the streets. His book, The Decameron, describes the horror. The living could barely bury the dead. The plague moved north through Europe like a wave of death. France, Spain, England, Germany, nowhere was safe. Paris lost half its population, 50,000 people. London buried so many bodies they ran out of cemetery space and dug mass graves called plague pits. One pit in London held over 50,000 bodies. Entire villages were abandoned. In England, over 1,000 villages disappeared completely. Everyone either fled or died. These lost medieval villages can still be found today, just empty fields where communities once thrived. The speed was incomprehensible. A town could be healthy one week and half dead the next. Families watched each other die one by one. Parents buried children. Children, orphaned overnight, became street urchins. Some regions suffered worse than others. Mediterranean port cities, being trade centers, were devastated. Rural, isolated areas sometimes escaped entirely, but no social class was immune. Peasants and nobles died equally. The clergy was hit especially hard, 40 to 50% mortality. Priests administered last rites to dying victims, exposing themselves constantly. Entire monasteries died. The loss of educated clergy created a knowledge vacuum that lasted generations. By 1353, when the plague finally subsided, Europe had lost a third to half of its population. The medieval world as it had existed was gone. Medieval medicine was completely unprepared for the Black Death. Doctors believed in the four humors theory, that illness came from imbalance of blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Their treatments were useless at best, harmful at worst. Bloodletting was common. Doctors would cut veins or use leeches to drain bad blood. This actually weakened patients, making death more likely. Physicians prescribed theriac, a concoction of 64 ingredients, including crushed emeralds, snake flesh, and opium. It did nothing. Some recommended holding bread against buboes to draw out poison, then feeding the bread to animals to transfer the disease. Others suggested bathing in urine or wearing excrement around the neck. Desperation led to absurdity. The iconic plague doctor costume emerged during later outbreaks. The bird-like mask with a long beak was filled with herbs and perfumes. Doctors believed this would filter bad air. The leather costume was an attempt at protection. It didn't work, but the image became synonymous with plague. Quarantine was one of the few effective measures, though they didn't understand why. Venice introduced the quarantino. Ships had to anchor offshore for 40 days before unloading. The word quarantine comes from quaranta, Italian for 40. Cities began closing their gates, refusing entry to travelers. Dubrovnik built the first lazaretto, an isolation hospital for plague victims. These measures did slow spread, but enforcement was inconsistent. Some turned to religious explanations. Flagellants roamed Europe, whipping themselves bloody to appease God's wrath. Thousands joined processions, believing self-punishment would stop the plague. It didn't, and these crowds actually spread disease faster. Jewish communities were scapegoated. False accusations of well poisoning led to massacres. In 1349, entire Jewish communities in German cities were burned alive. The plague killed Christians and Jews equally. The pogroms were based on prejudice, not evidence. Medieval medicine couldn't comprehend bacteria. They were fighting an invisible enemy with superstition and outdated theory. The Black Death exposed how little humanity understood about disease.
The Black Death didn't just kill people, it destroyed social order. Labor became the most valuable commodity overnight. Before the plague, Europe had a labor surplus. Peasants were expendable. After losing half the population, suddenly workers were scarce. Peasants who survived could demand higher wages. Fields went unplowed because there weren't enough workers. Landowners had to pay 2 to 3 times pre-plague wages, or crops wouldn't be harvested. This terrified the ruling class. England passed the Statute of Laborers in 1351, trying to freeze wages at pre-plague levels. It failed. You can't legislate against supply and demand. Serfdom began to collapse. Why remain bound to a lord's land when you could move to the next village and demand better terms? The rigid feudal system started cracking. Economic chaos followed. Trade routes disrupted, markets closed, currencies devalued. Entire industries collapsed when skilled workers died. Knowledge was lost. Specialized craftsmen took their skills to the grave. The church's authority was questioned. Prayers hadn't stopped the plague. Priests died like everyone else. If God was punishing sin, why did pious monks die while criminals survived? Faith was shaken. Psychologically, survivors were traumatized. Giovanni Boccaccio wrote that some people became extremely pious, others hedonistic, eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die. Normal social behavior collapsed. Family bonds broke. Parents abandoned sick children out of fear. Some people locked infected family members in houses to prevent spread. Trust eroded. Art changed too. Images of death, dancing skeletons, the Grim Reaper became common. The Danse Macabre, or Dance of Death, showed people of all social classes dancing with death. The plague's great equalizer. Death comes for everyone. This was civilization-level trauma that echoed for centuries.
The Black Death's effects shaped the next 200 years of European history. The Renaissance was partly born from plague. With labor scarce, survivors inherited multiple properties and wealth concentrated. This new wealth funded art and scholarship. Italian city-states like Florence became Renaissance centers, rebuilt on plague survivors' fortunes. Medical science advanced, eventually. The plague exposed medieval medicine's failures. This pushed some physicians toward observation and experimentation. Autopsies became more accepted. The scientific method slowly emerged from plague's lessons. Public health systems began. Cities realized sanitation mattered. Quarantine protocols became standard. The concept of public health, government responsibility for disease prevention, started with plague measures. The labor shortage accelerated technological innovation. With fewer workers, Europeans invested in labor-saving technology. Better plows, windmills, water mills. Mechanical innovation increased because human labor was expensive. Socially, the plague empowered the lower classes. Peasant revolts erupted across Europe. The English Peasants' Revolt of 1381, the French Jacquerie. These failed, but they signaled changing power dynamics. Feudalism was dying. Education changed. With clergy decimated, universities expanded to train new priests and doctors. More laypeople learned to read. The printing press, invented in 1440, spread knowledge that plague had nearly destroyed. Women gained economic opportunities. With so many men dead, women could inherit property, run businesses, and gain independence impossible before. These gains were temporary but significant. Religiously, the Catholic Church never fully recovered its pre-plague authority. The Church's failure to stop plague weakened its grip. This contributed to the Protestant Reformation 170 years later. Psychologically, Europe developed a darker worldview. Medieval optimism gave way to anxiety about death. This influenced everything from literature to theology. The plague returned in waves: 1361, 1369, 1374. Never as deadly as the first outbreak, but constant enough that Europeans lived with plague fear for 400 years until it finally disappeared in the 1700s. Modern science finally solved the Black Death mystery in 1894 when Alexander Yersin identified Yersinia pestis, the bacterium named in his honor. We now understand the transmission cycle completely. Fleas infected with bacteria bite rats. When rats die, fleas jump to humans. The bacterium multiplies in lymph nodes, causing buboes. Simple, deadly, preventable. Antibiotics like streptomycin can cure plague if caught early. The disease that killed 200 million is now treatable with a week of medication. Medieval doctors would consider this miraculous. But plague isn't extinct. 1,000 to 3,000 cases occur globally each year, mainly in Madagascar, Democratic Republic of Congo, and Peru. Poor sanitation and rat populations keep it alive. Climate change and urbanization could make plague more common. Warmer temperatures expand flea habitats. Dense cities with poor sanitation create ideal conditions, just like medieval Europe. The closest modern parallel is COVID-19. Both spread through trade routes. Both caused economic collapse and social disruption. Both revealed governmental unpreparedness. Both sparked conspiracy theories and scapegoating.